What's up, everybody? My guest in this episode is Chris Flanders, a missiologist and professor at Abilene Christian University. He does a pretty thorough job of introducing himself in the course of our conversation, so I won't belabor his qualifications and accomplishments. Instead, let me give you a taste of what you're in for. We explore his experiences as a missionary in Thailand, his decision to come back to the U.S. to pursue an academic career, the curious role of the scholar practitioner, the interdisciplinary nature of missiology, and a whole bunch of stuff connected to those topics. But the majority of our discussion is focused on Chris's area of expertise, honor and shame studies. We talk about definitions of honor, shame, and face, misunderstandings of these concepts, and even attempt to clarify some of the prevailing uses of shame language in popular culture, such as in Brene Brown's work and in the widespread critique of evangelical purity culture. It's a rich dialogue, and I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I did. So here it is, episode 3 of Theology on the Way with my friend, the Chris Flanders. Chris Flanders, thank you for joining me for one of my first episodes of Theology on the Way. Man, I'm excited that you're here. Thank you.
Well, you're more than welcome. It's a blessing and a pleasure and an honor.
An honor. We're going to talk about honor, aren't we?
We might end up talking about honor, but no, I'm privileged and am excited about having a conversation.
Yeah. Well, so I know where you are and a little bit about your background, although there's plenty that I would be very interested to hear about in detail. But for the sake of listeners, just tell us where you are right now, what your gig is, all that sort of thing.
So I teach in the Graduate School of Theology at Abilene Christian University in Abilene, Texas. I have a dual appointment, so I'm teaching in both graduate seminary level and also at the undergraduate level in our Department of Bible Missions and Ministry. Mm-hmm. And I have been doing that since 2005, which as the years go on, it is increasingly difficult to imagine that I've actually been here doing that for now 18 years plus. Before that, I grew up in the Midwest. I'm a Midwestern boy, mostly small Midwestern towns, though kind of claim, because I went to middle school and high school there, Duluth, Minnesota, as my ultimate, place, but all over Iowa, South Dakota, Minnesota. And then came to school here at ACU back in the 80s and started out, I was just talking to a friend last night at a Christmas party about this. I started as a music major. I was a trumpet.
Okay, this I didn't know.
I came here to study music. I wanted to perform. I wanted to move to Chicago and be a studio musician. That's what I wanted to do.
Oh, that's cool.
And, so as a music guy in high school, that was, you have musical people in your family. It was a singular passion. It was like all I did.
Listen, I graduated first year trombone from high school, so
I think I knew that too. That's really cool. So I came here and that was kind of my life, but the only thing I can explain is a slow, I might call it a holy hunger. I was a believer, I was committed, but slowly I began to develop a level of dissatisfaction with music as a career. Part of it, I think, was when you're a big fish in a small pond, and then you come to a larger pond and you realize, I'm good, but I don't know if I can actually, do the things that I've been dreaming about doing all of my life. People were pressing me to switch from performance to education. And my response at the time, which is ironic now, given where I've ended up, was, no, I don't want to teach. So I want to play. Anyway, I realized at this moment, wait, there's like Bible as a major here. I was taking Bible classes and I was loving it. And I was finding that the thing in my life that I was dying to get to, that I had to put off because of all my other commitments like music, was reading scripture, reading books about discipleship, and slowly, at the time, slowly stepping into what we might call theology.
Hmm.
And so I, in late in my sophomore year, switched my major to biblical studies, and that's what I ended up doing is an undergraduate degree in biblical studies, and became absolutely fascinated with and committed to biblical languages.
Mm.
I was a Greek nerd and was quite good. Not to
Yeah.
blow my own horn too much, but and I was good, and I really loved it. And then I got drawn into a summer because of a friend, a summer internship in Bangkok, Thailand, and also I, for the first time in my life, studied a spoken language other than English, which I had not done in high school because I'd somehow rerouted those requirements and done music instead of language. And so I came back with this new sense of, wow, that was really awesome. And I actually got really good feedback from missionaries about my ability to speak and adapt. And
Hmm.
when I finished my undergrad, I did a 2-year apprenticeship in Bangkok, Thailand with that same church and set of missionaries. And after those 2 years, I was really settled in my own self that this was the track that God was moving me towards. So I came back and did a Master of Divinity here, again at ACU, and an MA in missions. Met my wife, who was doing her work in marriage and family therapy at the time, and we joined or were a part of a church planting team that went back to Thailand. And
Hmm.
we were there as a couple with that particular phase of my life in Thailand for 8 years. Then came back, got a PhD at Fuller Seminary in Intercultural Studies, and then came straight here to ACU, and we've been here since. My wife is the assistant director of at the ACU Counseling Center and does therapy and counseling there.
Wow. Wow. So thanks for the quick run through. Um, I've
Hmm.
got I've got multiple questions. So first one, I moved around a lot too as a kid. Never very many years in the same place, different circumstances involved in that. But that rang a bell whenever you were describing that. Do you think that like prepared you in some way for living in a foreign place and sort of being able to make those transitions? Have you ever
I
thought about that?
do. I do. It as you know, and in contrast to my wife, who grew up in one place,
Yeah,
and
same with my wife.
her
Yeah.
mom, her dad passed away fairly recently. Her mom is still in that house, in that space, in that land, in the countryside in Western Kentucky. My experience, as it would with anybody who moved around frequently, adjusts a person to to being relocated, right? To
Right.
adjustment of different kinds, making new friends, sort of reconstituting your identity now based
Mm-hmm.
on now I'm in Minnesota, now I'm in South Dakota. What football teams do I root for?
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm in Minnesota. Do I root for local sports teams, or do I maintain my previous allegiances and adaptation of different kinds? So I think absolutely that movement around. I mean, you and I have both met the stereotypical military brats
Oh, sure.
who move around way more than I did, sometimes once a year or more than once a year. And I got to think that kind of life has to create in a person these capacities to shift and change as needed. So I would definitely think so.
Yeah, I've wondered how much of that is like, so there's a personality factor, right? There are other things that contribute to one's cross-cultural adaptability or situational adaptability or whatever. But I mean, as with you, the major contrast in my life was between I never lived anywhere long and my wife only lived one place ever.
Yeah,
And so
right,
for
right.
her, it felt like the universe was shifting on its axis. And for me, it felt like, well, the language is different, but it's more the same. So,
Right. And I hope that doesn't contribute to the a lack of ability to develop deep relationships. I don't think that it disqualifies us from that,
yeah, yeah,
but I do think that it does make it more of a challenge.
yeah.
I think that my wife in just innately is connected more deeply with certain people than I am, and I have
Yeah.
to work at it.
Yeah, so I've watched my kids go through this now,
Oh
and
yeah,
in a more extreme way, right? Because they're MKs, so they've gone through reverse. Well, we went through reverse culture shock. They just went through culture shock, moving to the U.S.,
yeah,
and then so we moved to and fro for PhD work, and landing here in Middle Tennessee for we're going on 4 years, and as you know, I'm looking at job possibilities, which would entail moving, and my middle daughter goes, "Well, it's been 4 years, so I guess it's about time." And I was like, "Oh,
ouch.
okay, but that's fair from her perspective." But they do have that. They do have that, like, well, we've never experienced being anywhere long, so
Yeah.
maybe it
So
won't be so bad.
that's incredible. And the difference is that my wife is from Western Kentucky, and several years ago I got for Christmas the Ancestry.com DNA thing,
Yeah.
and I'd only been tangentially interested in ancestry stuff.
Hmm.
When this hit, it popped that up a new level, and I got really into it for a while. I'm only mildly interested again, but for a season, a couple of years, I was into it, and I expanded both of our family trees farther back than either of us knew. But I at one point was looking at my wife's family tree, and I realized, oh my goodness, and I counted, and not only did my wife grow up in one place, I mean, she technically was born, so her dad was a doctor, and while he was in the Northeast at Johns Hopkins, he did his internship there. So she was actually born in Baltimore, but she was very young when she was actually, I'm sorry, born in Louisville, but they moved to Baltimore for a couple of years and then moved back. Um, her extended family on both sides, her mom and her dad's side, uh, it's either 4 or 5 generations, all lived in the same county in
Wow.
Kentucky, Grayson County, Kentucky. So you talk about a sense of locatedness and
Yeah.
like, this is our
Yeah.
place. We own Grayson County, Kentucky, you
Yeah.
know. And I would say, do you know this family? Oh yeah, I grew up with those kids. They were well, they're like your third cousins once removed. No, but like the whole county is populated with her relatives.
Man,
Um,
I didn't know how weirdly similar our spouses' families are.
huh.
Hers doesn't go 5 generations on both sides, but it goes back, and there's a real sense of like
Yeah. A
multi-generational.
locatedness,
Yeah,
an
and
identification
her
with,
dad's a physician, and so everybody in town knows him and all that kind of thing. So
right.
yeah, say
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
So,
that's wild.
uh, so there's a similarity in our experience there. And I would suspect that certainly makes it, more of a challenge
Hmm.
for people to uproot. Now you're giving me reason to go back home later tonight and get down on my knees and thank my wife again for being so
Right.
gracious and amazing, because I don't ever remember a single time during our whole time in Thailand where she ever complained about,
Wow.
look what you've done. I mean, there were challenges,
Yeah.
and there were times of sadness when we couldn't be there or we were hearing of our friends spending all this time with their, parents and with grandkids and such. Um, yeah, that, thank you. I'm gonna, maybe I need to buy her an extra Christmas present just so that.
Couldn't hurt.
It couldn't hurt.
So so what did life in Thailand look like? I'm not just what was the work, although that would be useful to hear, but what were those? You said 8 years?
Right. I was in Bangkok. So my time as a single guy and apprentice, whatever you want to call what I was, an apprentice, I guess is what I usually say.
Hmm.
2.5, pushing 3 years working with a church in Bangkok. And then together we were in Chiang Mai, I think just short of a month or two short of 8 years.
Okay.
What was life like? Well, it was sweaty. It was tropical Southeast Asia. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, perspiration's just a way of life there, but it is in a lot of places in the world. Um, it was the word that comes to mind is diverse, and for me, the diversity is kind of exciting.
Mm-hmm.
I can't speak for my wife. She tends to be one who's a little bit less enamored with difference and new things, and
Yeah, yeah.
likes to just kind of be settled on the tried and true, the
Uh-huh.
what we're used to. Not that she can't expand, but I like the shiny new stuff, and
Yeah,
so
yeah.
and for me, people and ministry opportunities presented this sort of diverse, hopeful possibilities. Um, we were blessed in an extraordinary way in that the mission team that we connected with really grew over multiple years, and in fact included my very best friend, who was my best man in my wedding, and I was his best man in his wedding. So he and his wife were on this church planting team, as well as the guy who got me to Thailand in the very first place. His name is Robert Reagan. His example, while he was here at ACU and doing a 2-year apprenticeship, kind of spurred on my own missional imagination. And he was actually the catalyst that got me to Thailand in the very first place. He and his wife were on this team, and several others, actually 2 other families. So it was a family team of 5 families.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Extraordinarily close, valuable relationships. So we never really struggled that much with what we often call team dynamics. I mean,
Right.
there were some things, but we already knew each other and loved each other and were committed. I mean, if we had any excessive tendencies, it would be the opposite. What one outside observer called team incest.
Yeah, okay.
Like sometimes we laugh. We're like, we're the team that met, with each other because we really love each other. And
Right.
but we were able to mitigate that, and obviously we ended up
Yeah.
planning all together 5 different communities of
Wow.
faith. So, but that was a real blessing. So, other than family, Kara and I both reflected on this. I mean, we got newsletters from our friends who were in parts of Africa where, after 2 years, we have finally gotten our generator and now we have sporadic electricity
Right.
and things like this. And we were living in tropical Southeast Asia, which other than the heat and the humidity is, gloriously green. Everything grows. So my wife became convinced that she had this magical green thumb, which then we successfully disproved when we moved back to the U.S. It was just Southeast Asia. But
You're saying
Thai
you're saying Abilene, Texas isn't as hospitable as
It's not, and actually requires real competence there, which my wife would now confess. Yeah, actually, it was just Chiang Mai. It was just Thailand.
yeah.
Um, but the food, we loved Thai food. We still love Thai food.
Well,
Half the
yeah.
world now loves Thai food. Back when we went in the early 90s, Thai food wasn't as big of a thing as it is now. We were with some of our very literally favorite people in the whole world. So it was like, well, where else would we rather be right here,
Yeah.
other than family? And the family thing was always a piece, and that was always a challenge. But and so I would say that life there, I mean, other than just the work proper, was extraordinarily rich and happy, life giving, and we still miss it. I mean, I think it's not an overstatement. I used to be able to say I miss it every single day. It's been more than 20 years now. I
Mm-hmm.
don't miss it every single day because I don't think about it every single day. But
Right.
I bet on the average, I think about Thailand in my life there 3 or 4 times a week. And anytime I do, it's almost inevitably a positive thing that I miss and kind of yearn for. So it was
So
really
why
powerful.
did you leave?
I literally got a call, and by that I don't mean the Lord spoke to me, but that literally I was heading out one morning to go to work. We had some office space in front in our, I think it would have been our second church plant, because of where I envisioned me going on that morning. And our phone rings, and my wife, I stop at the door because I'm like, well, I'll see if it's somebody for me. And my wife answers the phone and she goes, "Oh, hello. Wow. Yes, you too." And so I'm standing there going, and she's like, "Yeah, he's right here. Hold on a second." She cups the phone, and she hands it to me and says, it's Jack Reese from ACU. I'd never gotten a phone call in Thailand from Jack Reese, who is the dean of the College of Biblical Studies at ACU. And the gist of the conversation was that he and others in the department had been thinking about the future of missions. At the time, they had, several mission faculty, but they were beginning to advance in years and get senior, and they were just starting to think. And he literally invited me to come back, to get my doctorate and to come and teach. And I mean, I didn't see that one coming. I was a good student, and I made friends with many of my professors at the time when I was here doing my master's. Jack Reese was one of my professors. He was not the dean of the college, but I think he may have been the associate dean of the graduate school. But we got to be friends with him, and the Reeses had visited us while we were in Chiang Mai, and so we had developed a relationship with him. But my wife and I had anticipated being there much longer, though we always said we're here indefinitely 5 years at a time. Was how we framed that. But we didn't know how to ever determine the indefinitely. Maybe kids as they got through and into high school. I suspect that if you would have asked us at the time, we would have said, well, we'll be here until our oldest kid probably starts to push to the top of high school, and then we'll reconsider maybe moving back. So this was much earlier than we anticipated. But we committed it to God for about 6 months. We kind of agonized over it and prayed through it and had feedback from different people that we talked with. And in the end, we decided that this was the right move. And so we made that shift. It was hard. The day that we said goodbye, there have only been 2 times in my life, I think, that I can recall where I was speechless, like where I wanted to say something, but I literally couldn't vocalize a sound just because I was so overwhelmed. One was when I saw my wife walking up the aisle in our marriage ceremony, and though I wasn't supposed to say anything at the time, I absolutely felt the sense of awe, and she's doing this for me. This is impossible. But the other was at the saying goodbye to all the people, and then there was my best friend Sean, who had been along in this journey with me. My best man, I was his best man. And I turned to him because he had waited to let everybody else say goodbye. And I tried to say something and I couldn't. It's like the only other time in my life where, and I just sobbed, gave him a hug, and then turned and walked through the security spot. That was really hard. So even then there was this great sense of loss because everything was going well. Our team relationships were good. Our work was flourishing. My wife had, we didn't know how this would play out when we came, but then it did. She had found strong niches, opportunities to use her gifts. Her language was strong and solid, and our kids were happy. Both our kids were born there. So it was like down the checklist, everything was like positive green plus. And so that made it real hard. But for various reasons, in the end, we decided this really was God's call to us. And so we left. And of course, as you've experienced too, the culture shock, we moved to Los Angeles. We technically lived in Pasadena. And my wife ended up becoming the manager of an apartment complex where missionaries lived. It was a kind of missionary housing area off campus a ways. But we didn't know anybody. And it wasn't like we were that much closer to family because, from LA to Kentucky or Minnesota was still a 5 or 6 hour trip. Right. So not marginally closer than when we were in Thailand. But that's just telling that story to illustrate how deeply we loved and felt great about our time in Thailand.
So There must have been, as you agonized over months, something that, or more than one thing that really tipped the scales. Because I mean, you don't, things are going that well. You have a sense of calling to be there in the first place. I'm
Right.
familiar, um, and essentially you're pivoting not out of the world of missions, so called, but it's a vocational shift to go from on the ground missionary
Yeah.
to academic. So what is it that tips the scales, or why do you have the sense that this is the next step?
Um, so there are a few things. One, I realize now being on this side, so in academics for now, if you count my graduate studies, then over 20 years. I'm for lack of a better term, I'm just going to call myself a tweener.
Okay.
So when I'm with academics, I'm always the most practically minded person.
Yeah.
And you know, here I'm talking about that caricature, stereotypical uh, scholar academic,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Who just can't wait to get back to their office to close the door and get with their books and think grand thoughts and write things and I certainly can do that. But so when I'm with those kinds of people, and some of those are my colleagues here, and I recognize that gift. I'm not saying this as a negative
Right.
or
Right.
making any kind of judgment. But when I'm with those people, I'm typically the one who leans much more towards, well, how does this make a difference on the ground? And don't you think we need to kind of help people spell this out rather than just but what I also know from my time in Thailand is that when I'm with the more practical practitioners, I tend to be the one who's thinking more scholarly and thinking more academically, reading more things than other people,
Mm-hmm.
and bringing theoretical considerations into the practice.
Right.
And so there's I sometimes yearn for the ability to like be more on the end of those polarities. It seems that life identity would be easier
Right.
because I'm not always sure who I am in that regard. I'm both of those things. I'm a practitioner who can do scholarly things. I'm a scholar who is really concerned about practice. I think I may be speaking to someone else who is similar in that way
Well,
too.
yeah, I'm sitting here wondering, like, is that part of our friendship and why
Yeah.
it's been easy for us to understand one another and relate, and to me in a surprising way. Like I've got lots of acquaintances and lots of people that I've run across in that are committed to similar things that
Mhm.
but you don't always have that chemistry. You don't always
Right.
click in the same way. And for me, it
Yeah.
was like, well, I should tell the story of kind of where our relationship even started,
Okay.
but
Well,
the
tell the
point, yeah,
story, Greg.
but the point, on the other side of it is it was like really easy,
Yeah.
um, and
It,
so that
I-
happens
I'm a,
sometimes, but
I'm a few years down the road from you, age-wise. What I've realized it's still relatively rare. When I was younger, I probably thought it was like it just would happen all the time. But actually, as I've aged, I realize that it is rarer to find those people that there's just that immediate like, dude, I really want to be your best friend, or
yeah,
I cannot wait to spend time with you. I've always felt that with you, which is a cool thing. And even though we've never lived close
right,
to one another, um, and where you also have that ability to just pick up with ease
hmm
and to hang up with ease, this was in fact, what I left in Chiang Mai with some of my dearest, closest friends there, um, which made it hard. But um, trying to remember now, recall the train that we were pursuing before we did this little detour.
Well, I was just saying that you were talking about being the
Oh, the
practical scholar and the
practitioner. Right,
scholarly
right, right.
practitioner, and
Right.
we have that in common, and that's very much the case. But I was just wondering about, like, what
Oh,
is that part of the root of why it's so easy? There's just I don't know, there's a bent there,
yeah,
that
yeah.
that
And I think actually, so back, I recall now the original question, and that was, well, so talk about your decision to go if everything is all,
yeah.
all green lights and everything. I think it was, in fact, that particular quality about my own makeup that Jack and some of the other voices who were involved, it wasn't just a unilateral Dean thing, um, saw in me. In fact, one of the things that Jack told me, either in that conversation or in subsequent conversations, was he said, uh, both both sides of our college, I'll explain the sides here in a second, own you. They think you are one of them. And he said that makes you really unique because typically you don't find people who literally is considered an insider, and by both sides at the time, that was the missions people
Hmm.
and the Bible theology people.
Right.
That eventually shifted and changed, but that was one of Jack's calls to me. And so here is I don't know if you're familiar with the famous Steve Jobs pitch to Steve, not Steve.
Wozniak?
No, not Wozniak. It was to the guy that they ended up bringing on to be president of Apple. He was at the time working for, I believe, PepsiCo, and his name
Yeah,
escapes me.
I don't
But the
remember.
story is he was in his office and he looked at him and he says, "Do you want to sell colored sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world?" And his own telling of the story, and I should know his name. He says that got him. He was
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
yeah. So Jack Reese said to me, he says, "Come and help me missionalize all of undergrad and grad Bible," which at the time was a weird thought. I mean, it was a thought that Jack
Yes.
was having, and now it's almost a fait accompli. I mean, maybe not
Well,
in every way.
put that on the timeline. What year is this?
This would have been 2002.
Okay, yeah. So a matter of a couple of years since the missional theology movement really kicks
Right.
off.
And Jack had been drawn into the gospel in our culture stuff
Okay.
and had become friends with people like Pat Kiefert
Okay, so early
and
adapter is the word. Yeah,
Alan Roxborough and
adapter,
others.
early. Yeah.
And I don't know the details of how he became connected with them, but he was already drinking deeply in the well springs of theological and ecclesial imagination. And he saw in me an ally
Hmm.
uh, who who because of my own training, and this isn't to disparage our friends who are like this, but you have met, as have I, and maybe some of the listeners also know, the kind of, again, caricatured missionary who really isn't aware of broader conversations of biblical
Right,
studies or theology, is like mission stuff, right?
right.
Donald McGavern and Three Selves and
That'll do.
um,
Yeah.
and so I wasn't that kind of person. I had facility in biblical studies and in theology, and I appreciated those things. I mean, not just as a little sort of cursory side acknowledgement, but like genuinely had space in my own thinking and practice for those important conversations. And so, yeah, Jack stroked my ego a little bit,
Ah,
and but more than, it wasn't only that. It
of
was a
course not.
sense of, as one of my colleagues, as we were trying to discern, and I put this before my friends as we prayed together weekly, um, was the idea that, well, there are really two sets of ideas here from the same person, but the idea that best case scenario, my impact in northern Thailand would be like this.
Mm,
But going to a place like ACU where you've got students from all over who are going all over, you know, that potential maximum impact
hmm.
would be considerably larger. And so that was something that hit me strong. The same guy, his name is Robert Reagan, um, also said to me, and this was one of those non-intuitive, like, wait, what? That's so. It's the logic of the illogic.
Mm,
He said that everything is going perfect for you right now, Chris, is a strong argument that you should leave.
right.
And I had to process that, but the more I thought about it, the more that kind of was like, compelling in a weird, counterintuitive way. And his whole point was, if you decide this is what God wants you to do, you will leave with a beautiful narrative.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when I asked the question. After your description of everything going as well as it was, I thought, I mean, this is like a professional athlete winning the title and then retiring, right? Don't
So,
wait until you're running on fumes.
I'm Michael Jordan retiring after the fifth championship or
Yeah,
what.
yeah, yeah. You just go, all right,
All
I
right,
did it. I'm
I did
good.
everything I
I'm
could here.
good. No, but I mean, it's actually really important that there is a kind of trajectory historically. Now, I don't know what the percentages are, but I know enough people who fit this description to sort of generalize. There's a trajectory that goes from long-term missionary who maybe is in the field a long time and then comes back and does a PhD real quick and becomes a professor, and that puts a lot of these professors in a certain phase of life in a way that doesn't apply to like any of the other faculty trajectories in the Bible department, right? And so it's actually really interesting for someone who is in an earlier phase of life to go, all right, I'm going to pivot now and do
Yeah,
do the academic certification and launch into this formation role, this sort of I don't know, what word would you use, like higher level of influence role on this large student body over the
right,
course of many years
right.
at an earlier age that in some ways is, I don't know, it just brings a different dynamic with student teacher relationships and perspectives. Anyway,
Yeah,
that strikes me
absolutely.
as really interesting as like a good move to
And,
make.
and I think Robert at the time and all of us were reflecting in our own experience. There were several, and I can think of three specific missionary, what we would probably call missionary failures. People who left because indiscretion, some of it was
Yeah.
moral or family failure, or that sort of classic missionary who's outlived their usefulness but
Hmm.
does fails to really see it, and so they become this almost shameful figure where you're embarrassed for them,
Right.
and the kind of cringe sort of situation.
Right.
And so we were aware of several of those, and that was part of what prompted my friend Robert to give me that perspective. Was not he qualifies it, not that I'm anticipating this to necessarily be something that you will inevitably face if you stay here, but if you were to go back now, the story you tell is really a story of vibrancy and
Yeah.
goodness
Exactly.
and wholeness, and what a great way to tie a
And
bow
and
around your
humility.
career.
No, for real. I mean, there's a real sense in which
Please, not
missionaries
many
have a
people.
hard time leaving because they
uh,
feel like I'm essential here. If I go, things are
yeah,
not going to go well, right?
right.
And
Well, that's the rest of the story. As soon as I left, everything fell
everything
apart.
fell apart. Yeah,
And
I'm not surprised to hear it
yeah,
because
no. But no, you're right. It does put oneself into greater perspective because there's always that tendency to overinflate my own, necessity, I have
hmm
to be there.
hmm
Um, and yeah,
I mean,
so it
that's
was.
less the case when you got a strong team like you did.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. It wasn't like, my goodness, no, literally fearing that believers would fall away or
No,
churches would fall
no.
apart. Yeah, there were a
But
lot of.
you're contributing something. Your wife is contributing something that's vital. That's
Yeah,
certainly part of the formula, and that's a hard choice. I mean,
it was a hard choice. Yeah,
for sure.
this is why it took us so long.
Hmm. So you make the shift, and you land at Fuller,
Mhm.
doing an intercultural studies degree. Which how long before had Fuller changed the name from missions department to intercultural studies department?
Fairly recently,
Yeah.
before I got there, because there was still a lot of legacy, like
Yeah.
um, templates, like
Mm-hmm.
that were called swim templates, right? School of World Mission templates.
Yeah.
When they had formally made the switch to the School of Intercultural Studies. My degree was a PhD in Intercultural Studies.
Right.
I think most of the course prefixes had by that time changed, but yeah, that that whole world of the former Fuller School of World Mission was still right there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I TA'd mostly for Sherwood Lingenfelter, but there was one moment where I got to TA for Chuck Kraft,
Right.
who still kind of, I think, represented or embodied and maybe even preferred, I don't know, because I didn't get to know him that well, that older modality of what Fuller had been about for quite some time.
Right.
Yeah, so it was right on the hinge of that change.
Yeah, I thought so. That's what I recalled from the timing. So for listeners who aren't familiar, there's this shift. It happens in a bunch of schools across the country around this time where the language of missions in the academy sort of shifts to the language of intercultural studies. So intercultural studies is code for missions, right? But it's coded in such a way as to say academically rigorous, anthropologically serious formation for cross-cultural Christian workers, right? Something like
Yeah,
that.
that's right, and I think that also there are the less charitable ways of framing that, because I think that it was in some places made just purely crassly for sort of advantage of I don't know what you call it, a less thoughtful, less careful kind of set of reasons. But
Mm,
at Fuller was not like that, I think, mostly.
right.
And one of the things that ICS as a designation does is it really exposes the interdisciplinarity of what we've always been doing, right? You highlighted anthropology there, but missiology I mean, it is the quintessential interdisciplinary discipline,
That's right.
right? As much as any other, though technically I think you can, with the same lens, genealogical lens, unpack every discipline and reveal how porous our boundaries are when we
Mm-hmm.
when we
Mm-hmm.
say theology or biblical studies or whatever. But
Yeah, well, in fact,
missiology,
Chris, I won't even call missiology a discipline because it is not a discipline. It
fair,
is a field of study, right? That is,
fair,
it's a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary field of
right,
study.
right.
And so I pretty conscientiously, it slips out sometimes, but I pretty conscientiously just won't call it a discipline because that's so confusing. Because the point you're making is like, you're going to be in 5 different areas in the course of even
Yeah,
specialized PhD study.
right. Yeah, so my work, people say, well, what's a PhD in intercultural studies like? And so a bunch of my work was under Veli-Matti Karkkinen,
Mm-hmm. Systematician.
specifically in systematic theology,
Mm-hmm.
which made me a bit anomalous in the ICS school. There were fewer people who would do stuff with the School of Theology, but there were still some. I was not the only one. And then a bunch of anthropology, but then also a bunch of social sciences like face and face work theory, which is its own little subdiscipline within that overlaps between communication and social psychology and anthropology,
Mm-hmm.
and then history, right? The historical study. I did my work focusing on the area of face in Thai culture, and
Mm-hmm.
so that took me right into to the arena of honor and shame conversations. And unbeknownst to me at the time, as soon as I got there, it's like, whoa, people have been talking about praise and blame since at least Confucius and Aristotle.
Right.
And there's this vast historical repository of conversations about these very things. And honestly, I didn't know about any of that, so I was doing history,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So in my configuration of intercultural studies was part systematics, part anthropology, part history, part other social sciences, communication theory,
Mm-hmm.
globbed into one, hopefully harmonious whole, at least it cohered. And I don't know if it was harmonious. Um, and yeah, somewhere over here, I've got, oh, there it is. It's sitting over, it's not hanging on my wall. I'm not that pretentious, but it's the Alan R. Tippert Award for Interdisciplinary Studies. So I got the award from my dissertation for
Wow.
being a good example of bringing different worlds together in a coherent way to make something new. And I've always felt like that's part and parcel of my own makeup. So that's
Hmm.
kind of why I'm
Hmm.
a tweener, right? The theory and the praxis person, but also the person who loves biblical studies. But here I've got a book, Honor of Phenomenology, which is political theory and historical thinking, Hobbes and Locke on history, on honor and shame, stuff like that.
Right.
And I've always been able to kind of live in multiple spaces in that regards, just kind of who I am.
Okay, so let's just park there for a second because I'm very similar in my let me put it the way that others would see it, lack of focus.
There
um
are two ways to frame that. One
uh-huh.
is
Uh-huh.
that.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
one is, I would call you a polymath, but
Jack of all trades, master of none, as they say.
yeah,
But
you don't have to say both of those things, but sure.
but um but yeah, I find it what I'm curious about is something very practical for you. I find it absolutely delightful to try to live in those multiple worlds and see where they overlap, make connections. That's where the most generative stuff for me happens. Those connections between supposedly siloed areas of thought. But I also find it unbelievably difficult to keep up with the reading for multiple areas.
Oh,
And so I'm just like, what do you do? Like,
it,
how do
it,
you?
I suffer like you. Um, and so, yeah, as I think back to my time at Fuller, because, and I see this in you as well, we're not unique in this regard, but a real strong level of intellectual curiosity, right? I want to know stuff.
Hmm.
And a lot of times you learn about something, you're like, wait, what? Wow, that's a new idea. That's a new area. So one of the most distinctive ways that this happened to me while I was at Fuller, because of two sources. I had dabbled in theology, certainly in my graduate work here at ACU, much more in biblical studies, just because of the nature of our program. Had some theology, which was massively influential, mostly through Leonard Allen.
Hmm.
Uh, and he planted the seeds of some stuff that would grow over time. I didn't at the moment realize how much that was going to be the case. But when I got to Fuller, um, I made two friends. One was a guy who was there as a scholar in resident. He teaches, still does, psychology at Valparaiso University up in Indiana.
Hmm.
He was a neuroscience guy. He had his PhD from UCLA in cognitive neuroscience, like
Hmm.
not just cognitive science, but like the brain
Right.
stuff.
Right.
And then he was there as a visiting scholar working with the School of Psychology. But every day he would spend his mornings at the Fuller Coffee Shop, where I am wont to be in the morning. So we got to be good friends. Well, he's reading tons of philosophy. I'm
Hmm.
like, well, that's interesting. You're a neuroscientist. And he said, man, he was about 15 years older than me. I'm sure he was a hippie in the 60s, and he still carried that kind of hippiness to him. He's like, man, everything ultimately comes back to philosophy, dude. And I was like, oh, okay. So I'm spending time with him and catching up. So like, what are you reading right now? Okay, well, tell me about whatever you're reading. And at the same time, I developed a really close friendship with a guy at Fuller who was doing his PhD in theology, Jeff Phillips. And I think I've mentioned Jeff to you before.
Hmm.
Jeff was working in theory of language, and Jeff exposed me to two people who two thinkers who really rocked my world, and to this day I would consider to be, among the most influential. One is Alistair MacIntyre,
Hmm.
who I had heard of but probably had never read before,
Right.
and the other is Wittgenstein,
Yeah.
and I had not touched, maybe hardly even knew the name. And my friend Jeff was like, "Oh man, theory of language,
Yeah.
analogical language, Wittgenstein." He says, "You don't know," and I'm like, "I have." So he starts talking Wittgenstein up, and I'm like, "Well, I went through like months where I've got my coursework and stuff, but all I can do is just find more Wittgenstein."
Right.
But nothing I'm doing in terms of my coursework is feeding that. It's all like add-on.
Yeah.
And so I cite that moment to say that happened like a lot,
Hmm.
where
Hmm.
I would learn about some other piece of a larger puzzle and go, pause, or I'm just going to do the minimum that I can here to kind of get this going, but I've got to learn more about this.
Yeah.
And it turns out Jeff went on to Cambridge, and he's teaching there now. He's teaching in philosophy and theology, and I will always be thankful to Jeff for introducing me to a person. I would say you got to put Wittgenstein in like the top 10 most
Yeah.
important people of the 20th
Yeah.
century.
Yeah. He will break your view of the world.
He
He
will
will.
break your view of the world, and and language, and then how you constitute identity.
Yeah.
So much there. So that's just another example. So Wittgenstein is a philosopher. He's never a part of my coursework proper.
Hmm.
None of the professors that I'm working with are telling me you need to think about Wittgenstein. And yet he became really important to my Fuller experience. If you were to ask me,
Yeah.
tell me the five most important things that happened to you at Fuller, one of those five things would be I discovered Wittgenstein and a better way to think about language.
Yeah.
But it wasn't directly from any coursework. It was just this thing that I bumped into. So
Yeah.
I've tended to be like that throughout my career.
Hmm.
I always seem to find my way back to the work. I mean, I do my work, obviously, and
Yeah.
I finished my PhD, and I continue to finish my grading every semester. I always tie those bows nicely and neatly. But if you were to look at my desk here, and the categories of books that are on display right now in front of me that I've been working with lately, it's kind of all over the place. Yeah.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, it's been like that, where sort of a desperate hunger drives the investigation when you've already got your plate full, and it's like, I
Yeah.
really shouldn't, but I like have to. I'm on this trail now, and I've got to see where it leads.
Right.
And the funny thing is, it's often like, if somebody asks me what I'm reading, and I say, well, I'm reading Wittgenstein, or I'm reading Paul Ricoeur, or something like that, or on some topic, like I'm reading on Zionism a lot right now, and it's like, well, why? What does that have to do with the main thing that you're working on?
Right.
And the answer for me is pretty consistently like, I don't know yet. Like, that's the
Yep.
whole point, is like,
Yeah.
there's something there that I have to figure out what it
There's an
has to do with
intimation.
everything else. Yeah.
There's this sense that there's something here, and sometimes it doesn't pan out.
Right. Right.
I've got plenty of examples of that. Those were just dead
That's
ends
the
for
perfect metaphor for it. Pan out. I mean, you're searching
out.
for gold, and you spend a
Yeah,
long
yeah.
time finding nothing. Yeah.
A lot of nothing. And I don't know how often. I mean, I think my intuition is relatively solid. Maybe that's been honed by the years.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. And I find it makes my thought world, my thought palaces, whatever metaphor,
Mm-hmm.
rich and diverse, but sometimes maddeningly unfocused, like you said. I think what tends to help me focus, in fact, I'm in this mode right now, are writing projects. It's like when I end up saying
Yeah.
yes to okay, yeah, I'll write that thing, or I'll make that presentation. Then all of a sudden my universe tends to get very narrow and relatively focused, and I pursue that project. And then when I'm done with that, I'm like, okay, I bought these 3 books while I was working the month and a half I was working on that thing, and now can't wait to read those 3 books, which have nothing to do with anything
Right.
that
With it in any way.
oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, same thing.
Yeah. No, that, I think that sounds right in my experience, but I mean, I think it sounds like something that I've seen and heard before, which is that, writing is the discipline of like giving focus to your research and your learning, right? And so it
Right.
kind of crystallizes and comes out if you're doing if you're doing well as an author. Anyway, I mean, that lack of focus happens sometimes, as one having edited a number of works. Sometimes you kind of wonder
Yes.
where is the crystallization here?
Where, but yeah, so the focus does, and it comes in classroom work and
Hmm.
teaching
Hmm.
too,
Oh
uh,
yeah. Yeah.
where you have to distill things and narrow them. But if like I could be independently wealthy and just do stuff that would make me happy,
Hmm.
I would teach too, but I would just spend a lot of time reading stuff
Yeah.
and all over the place, right?
Yeah, I actually when I play that hypothetical in my mind, it's interesting to me how similar it looks to the old style of sort of tenured professorship,
Hmm.
where you do want to do some teaching, but you want it to be like one course a semester so that you can, but you want to do the teaching, like you don't,
Yeah.
but really what you would like to do is keep building out that that schema that you're trying to funnel into the teaching and the writing. That idealized version of things that
Yeah.
used to exist and
It used
and
to exist. It still does. The only person I know who actually has had or had that life, many years ago, we had a lecture series here that I superintended, and for our first one, we brought in Philip Jenkins from, at the
hmm.
time, Penn
Hmm.
Penn State was where he was. I think he's now connected with Baylor, and so we were spending, because I was the director of the lectures, I got to spend a lot of time with Philip Jenkins and every other subsequent person who came, which was a cool,
That's cool.
side bonus of that. And so we were just talking. I said, "Well, what's your teaching load like?" And he said, uh, not to quote him, but to basically what he said was his teaching load was 0 and 3, and for him that was probably 3 too much. In other words, he just wanted to
Yeah,
research.
just
He
want to
wanted
be
to
a
read
researcher.
and research and
Eh,
explore and publish.
yeah.
But Penn State required him to teach some upper level graduate methods course in historiography.
Yeah,
So,
as,
so he
as
did,
they should, of course.
as they should, absolutely. But yeah, so there are people like that. But I think universities. It was the dirty little secret that I had to learn about my current employer, which I love. But you always, I think as a student, I wasn't in tune with these kinds of things. But when you get here and you realize, actually, this is a business,
Hmm.
and that it operates with the kinds of concerns, not in the exact same way, but lots of things are about who's going to pay for that, and or who
Hmm.
or monetary concerns. So one of the reasons why people like me and all of my colleagues teach full loads is, because the university couldn't afford to make us all Philip Jenkins.
Right.
So, yeah.
That that brings us near to questions that I've been asking everyone I've recorded with so far. But I which are questions about the future of theological education.
Mm.
Um, and I want to ask those questions, but actually first I want to be sure we talk about face work, as you mentioned, honor shame stuff. I want to sort of delve into your expertise a little bit to clarify my own understanding, and I think people will find it interesting. So let me lay out the difficulty as I see it that you could help with.
Okay.
And that is that when we talk about honor and shame in popular culture, it's not obvious how that maps onto honor and shame in the world of sort of technical anthropology and culture studies. In other words, there's a definitional mismatch, it seems to me at times, or if there's not, I don't understand how the language is actually working. And and I think that's in part because the terms have become so, well, shame in particular has become so prolific of late, through, researchers and authors like Brene Brown. And I know people have different opinions about sort of what she's doing with that, but then the whole phenomenon of sort of, I don't know, demonizing shame in the evangelical subculture, where particularly in relation to purity culture, from like when I was growing up in the 90s, shame was a real lash that the church used to kind of address sexual promiscuity and those sorts of things. And so that's had a backlash in recent years. I remember not long ago I sent you an article in the New York Times about the scars of shame that the purity culture inflicted on a generation of evangelicals and that sort of thing. And so I think that confuses things a little bit, because it's like, what are we talking about? So I wonder if you would kind of give us a a robust technical definition of honor and or shame. I mean, I know they're sort of two sides of a coin in a way. Um, and then help me start thinking through, like, what does that have to do with this other stuff, this shame stuff going on in the American culture?
Yeah, how much time you got?
Okay. We'll do our best. We'll do our best.
Yeah. So this whole area, if it doesn't cohere into a nice, neat package like this, but let's just call it honor shame studies or honor shame conversations,
Okay.
has often been thought, particularly by modern English speaking, and we can add German and French in there too, I suspect, um, culture
Mm-hmm.
as backward, as something that is the property of these other cultures, these other peoples. I argue really that's an unfortunate kind of type of modern, to borrow Edward Said's idea of orientalizing, because it typically
Mm.
goes with Oriental or Mideastern cultures.
Yeah.
It has been rare that any person has thought of honor shame cultures as something that happens in Africa or Latin and South America, even though you know yourself, being someone who's had plenty of experience in South America, but also connection with African scholars and Christians, that those same dynamics are a part of those places as well. And one of the major, if you would call it, jobs or goals that I have for my own scholarship and writing currently, is to help deconstruct
Mm-hmm.
the ways that we caricature or we configure that with those kinds of schema, honor shame cultures, and we typically have an opposition culture, which we might call guilt innocence or guilt justice, where ostensibly we don't do that. We're not interested in honor, and we sure don't do that shame stuff.
Mm-hmm.
There we might think of, here in the North American context, we might think of pistols at 20 steps,
Mm-hmm.
or the dunce cap, which was outlawed in the early 20th century, though still persisted, it turns out, for a little bit of time afterwards. So, and all kinds of complex ways that society engaged in shaming. And I want to say, though we don't have enough time really to unpack it sufficiently here, that's a myth.
Mm-hmm.
And a myth in the sense of not the positive social scientific sense of myth, but a myth in the sense of a falsehood.
Mm-hmm.
That when you really explore cultures. And that includes, I am living here in West Texas and at the end of the year 2023. And my work at the university and my life in Abilene, Texas has honor and shame dynamics at almost every level of my experience, as does certainly the place where I lived and worked for many years in Thailand. The difference is, of course, the way that the activities and even the standards, the things to which people attach those honor, shame, face commitments,
Mm-hmm.
those things can differ, and they can differ considerably from culture to culture to culture. So that then brings us back to your question, and that is, can we have a good definition? Because one of the problems in literature, and there are many scholars actually, I'd noted this book by Robert Aprisco, An Honor of Phenomenology, and one of the reasons I like this book is that he offers a really wonderful critique of this, what I would call a dichotomous viewpoint, right? That there are
Mm-hmm.
these discrete things called honor, shame cultures, and then
Mm-hmm.
some other, typically, as it works out in the literature, no surprise, the guilt innocence type of culture tends
Mm-hmm.
to be viewed by those who write about this to be a superior, both in terms of, falling back on that kind of older Taylor notion of the evolution of cultures, right?
Mm-hmm.
A higher level of cultural evolutionary achievement, and specifically within Christian and even missiological conversations, because it's assumed that those things connect with Scripture, because as we know, sin in Scripture is thought of as the breaking of God's law, and
Right.
so ostensibly any kind of Christian influenced culture would necessarily then be a guilt culture, right? Because it recognizes it's standing before a holy and good God, because we've broken his law. We now stand in a guilty place. And a lot of theology and certainly at the practical level, evangelistic work and missiology has traded on those kinds of notions. But
Yeah.
honor itself is and you can go back to Aristotle or to Confucius, two early thinkers who thought deeply about these things. Honor is really about a positive evaluation and the recognition that something is in fact positive. Honor always trades on some standard of virtue. Now, it might not match a classic definition of virtue in terms of ethical or philosophical thinking, but something that a person or a subculture considers excellent.
Right.
So whenever you have some form of excellence, what you've done is you've automatically, by necessity, created honor, because what honor is the recognition of that virtue, and then
Mm.
the human tendency to approve, right? To show approval, whether
Yeah.
that's a thumbs up
Right.
or applause or giving awards, titles, etc. There are all kinds of complex ways that we engage in honorification. So really at its core, honor is simply a positive recognition of some kind of virtue.
Yeah.
But that virtue itself, because in our minds, a lot of our minds, I think virtue tends to be moral, but virtue can be social.
Right.
Virtue can be height. It can be if you are a 10th century Viking. It can be virility and combat excellence.
Yep.
If you are living in Germany in the late 1930s, it could be blonde hair and blue eyes.
Right. Right.
It's a form of excellence to which we acknowledge and give a level of recognition.
Yeah. Okay. So that makes sense to me. I mean, when I start, and I read your article in the Festschrift that you edited for
Oh,
Sherwood
okay.
Lingenfelter,
Yeah.
which for readers is called "Devoted to Christ," and the subtitle is "Missiological Reflections in Honor of Sherwood G. Lingenfelter," who was your doctoral mentor at Fuller. And so you had sent me this article, and I had read you also co-edited this one, and the introduction that you and Werner do there offers a little bit more accessible but far briefer sort of introduction to some of the terms that are at stake and so on. That one I'll read it just in case this is a listen to an audio, honor, shame, and the gospel, reframing our message and ministry, co-edited by Christopher Flanders and Werner Mischke, if I'm saying that correctly. Um,
Yep.
and so yeah, so I had, I've got these sort of introductory essays that I'm thinking through, and when I realize what you're saying, what you just said, which is that, essentially every culture has a value system, um, by which it ascribes the achievement of or the deficiency of the virtues that it holds. Yeah, excellence. Well, to say it more briefly, excellence. And I go, okay, that makes perfect sense. And in fact, it's puzzling to me that anyone would look at Western cultures. I'm thinking now just of my own as an American, and
Right.
not recognize that we, when someone graduates with honors,
There
that's
it is.
precisely
Yeah.
what we're talking about. Or when someone says, it's such an honor to speak to you today because they've been
Right.
asked because of their status and achievements to address an audience. Like that language is just right there. We talk like that. So it's puzzling to me that anyone would think that's not, that we're not an honor culture, that honor doesn't play a significant role culturally for us. So what is it that anthropologists thought, and I'm going to say
Right.
thought, used to think
Used to think.
is happening in Eastern cultures and not in Western cultures? Well,
So, so there's an interesting historical genealogy here. The language of honor culture and shame culture really comes into the English vocabulary, and as far as I understand, that's really where it starts with the work of Margaret Mead, but particularly her student Ruth Benedict and her book, The
mm-hmm.
Chrysanthemum and the Sword, which I don't know where to track these kinds of things, but for a season
Mm.
years ago was the best-selling uh, anthropology book of all time. Um, Benedict, herself an anthropologist, interestingly was contracted by the U.S. government during the Second World War. And she's an anthropologist, and the State Department gives her the mandate to help the military and the State Department understand the weirdest, oddest enemy that they'd ever faced, Japan.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So she writes an ethnography of Japanese culture. Now, Benedict had never been to Japan. She did not do classical ethnography there, in Japan. She relied on informants, many of whom were Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
So she
Mm-hmm.
does a level of what we might call armchair anthropology
Yeah.
from her space here in North America. But she writes this ethnography, and in it she makes claims that give the language of honor, shame, or shame culture versus guilt culture to the English-speaking world. And one of the things that she does in there is she says this: a true shame culture is a culture that is only concerned with public reputation, not morality, and lacks an internalized conscience.
Mm-hmm.
Well, most of us sitting here today would kind of go, wait, a human who lacks internalized conscience. Wow, that's a bold claim.
It's a dehumanizing claim.
It is.
Yeah.
And in fact, if you understand what the situation was, she and I can't get into the mind of Ruth Benedict, but many scholars have since properly critiqued her, not just her writing, but the actual situation. Think about World War II, right? And you think about all the way that we dehumanize Japanese in comic books and in Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck cartoons. Not Donald Duck, but the gross misrepresentations of Japanese faces
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
accents and behavior, etc. And no, I don't think that she engages at that level. Clearly, what ends up happening out of it is this gross caricature
Yeah.
of a society that is completely other. Again, so we bring Said right in here and talk about the orientalizing of that culture. That stuck. That
Mm.
because it was so successful as a book,
Hmm.
not just in the academy, but at the popular level. And then it took decades, if not longer, in anthropology for that to get untied in a helpful way. It still persists, but it certainly persists at the popular level. And if you read some of the earlier missiological conversations about different cultures, particularly the Middle East and Asia, not to critique overall the influence, positive influence of men like David Hesselgrave and Paul Hebert, but as is the case, Michael Rinkovic does this in one of his books. Missiology tends to be a couple of decades behind
Yes.
on those disciplines that they tend to rely most upon, anthropology. And here was a classic example where people like Hesselgrave in several of his writings in the 70s and 80s, and Hebert as well, continued to perpetuate these ideas. Well, so when you're a student in the early 90s studying missiology at Abilene Christian and the fare that you're being fed is primarily Hesselgrave and Hebert, the honor shame societies.
Right.
What that does is obviously is labeling any society as an honor shame society. What that does is it does two things. One, it then produces the conditions or the ingredients by which caricaturing can happen and does happen. But it also has a reflexive impact in that it tends to then cause us to not think of ourselves in those terms at all.
Hmm.
And usually what it does is it creates a situation where people will say, well, of course we do honor here, right? Yes, I went to my daughter's award banquet, and I like it when people call me Dr. Flanders. And of course, I also have this plaque that was given to me to recognize a certain level of virtue that I achieved in my writing my dissertation. But we're not like that. And really, that's where the literature has stagnated.
Yeah.
Is that it hasn't dealt with that weird tension. Well, of course we do shame, and we have shame, and I feel shame sometimes, and I see shame out there, but we're not like an honor shame society.
So okay. So
Yeah.
I'm getting into this here, and my mind
Okay.
is spinning.
Okay.
So I didn't realize, having read those couple of pieces that I mentioned, I didn't realize that the dichotomy between objective and subjective honor actually goes back to Benedict, because it sounded like that's what she was actually putting her
Yeah.
finger on without understanding
Exactly.
that all cultures have both,
Yep.
and that maybe she was like intuitively right that one of the differences culturally is that many Western cultures don't they don't give as much credence to objective honor as do Eastern cultures because of the difference on the individualism collectivism scale.
Yep.
Uh, is
I,
that
I,
is that
I
close to
think
accurate?
that is really close to the core of what's happened. My German is not strong, so
Yeah,
I'm
mine
very
either,
thankful for
regretfully.
um, especially German sociology. But there's a German sociologist, Ludgera Vogt is her name, and she's written quite a bit in the last few decades on honor and some to some degree shame, but primarily honor in the German culture.
Mm,
And her writing really exegetes culturally so how clearly Germany never abandoned something that we might call an honor culture.
mhm,
And I don't think that America does either, but you're,
mm,
you're pointing to some important differences. So there's sort of external social honor, but there's not only just the existence of it, but there's also these important valences that come into what level do we attach to that,
right.
right? Personally, do I consider that to be, I'm a doctor. Doctor is an honorific. That's an honor phenomenon. How important is it for me to be called doctor? How
Right.
important does my culture tell me I should always be called doctor and
And
not?
and that's, to be clear for the listener, that's when I said objective honor. That's the
That's what
honor
you're
that
referring to.
others ascribe to you.
Yeah.
So it's
Right.
you're the object of being honored in that
Right.
sense.
But
And
there's this subjective sense.
and then the
We
subjective honor where I
well
feel I'm honorable even if no one else gets it.
exactly, and this is where again we lose it. It becomes an issue of vocabulary then, because often we don't consider that to be honor, even though one of the fundamental ways we experience that is something that we call self-esteem,
Yes.
and esteem is honor, right?
Right.
So this kind of privatized sense of being, look, and maybe you have conversations with your kids, as did I, where they're in school and there's something going on, and you say to them something like, sweetie, it it really doesn't matter what other people think about you, right? What's important is this other thing. Maybe
Yeah. Yeah.
it's your own sense of, or maybe it's,
What
I like to
God
tell
thinks
my
of you,
students,
right?
like
Yeah. Yeah.
life is you and an audience of one, right?
Right.
So
Right.
so God, but also this sense of, well, you do what you believe to be the right thing. We might not use language of honor. So then
Conscience. So that's where Benedict's conscious language is interesting in that regard.
it really is. And again, if you read the chrysanthemum and the sword, what you see are these little slippages where she recognizes
Yeah.
some of the problematic implications of what she says, but that doesn't really keep her from paving this.
Being in her cultural moment, and yeah, but
Right.
it turns out scholarship has context. So
It turns out scholarship does have context. There in anthropology was a resurgence in the 60s and 70s of a similar sort of thing around the what was often called the anthropology of the Mediterranean, which highlighted important cultural distinctives. Hospitality was
hmm
often
hmm
highlighted, but also these issues of honor and shame reemerged. And it was another instantiation of these strong. So it was sort of like the Benedict fire maybe was waning a little bit. So somebody came in and threw a couple of big logs in of the anthropology of the Mediterranean. And that reactivated then these ideals, even though the scholars who would write in this vein often, again, like Benedict, would intuit that, well, of course, it's more complex than this, and it's not that they're entirely different than us, but they're entirely different than us.
Right. Right.
And so again, that language gets out there both in scholarship and at the more popular level, and it continues to then reify
Right.
these types which we still to this day continue to operate with.
Yeah.
And
So
so
so it's almost as though the blind spot for our own culture is the bigger deal because it's not, I mean, cultural
right.
difference is non-trivial. So it's like to say there's a huge difference between us and them, however you're defining those categories, is almost an uninteresting observation. It's like you know that if you meet somebody from a very different culture. And
Right.
you know it when you meet somebody from a similar culture that's different, it's not as much difference. And so there's clearly such a thing as cultural distance. Okay. But at the stakes of the analytical categories are almost like how much can you understand yourself, not how much can you understand them,
Right.
and or
That's
misunderstand yourself or misunderstand. And
yeah,
so
and that of course this broad dichotomous typology then blinds us to our own honor shame dynamics.
right.
Face. This was one of the things that stunned me when I got to Fuller and I was going to focus on face and Thai culture. I was unfamiliar with this new area of face and
hmm
face work theory. And when I started to dig deeply into it, there was this moment. It was one of those eureka moments. You've had them before. I was reading theorists who were writing about this, and it just hit me. I'm reading about face and face work, which are the complex ways that we enact face in intercultural, interpersonal
Yeah, so
conversation.
listeners would have heard the phrase saving face.
Sure,
That's this world of
right.
cultural.
But here's
Yeah.
the thing: face is kind of a field where honor and shame play out in complex
hmm
ways. Interpersonally, it's communicative. Usually, it has to do with identity. It has to do with identity claims in social space, etc. So it's
hmm
quite complex. But as I was reading, I don't remember the spot where I was at, but I do remember this moment where I went, "Wait a second." Like every single theorist that I'm reading about on this face stuff is Western, and their research is coming out of the modern West.
Uh,
I was like, huh, because that coupled the difficulty of finding really excellent scholarly sources on Thai face. I was like, well, this culture should be writing about face all the time, but they're not. There were just a few crumbs, and at the same time, there was this exploding amount of literature that was all coming out of
Western anthropology
anthropology and communication theory,
and communication. Yeah.
often under the rubric of politeness theory.
Mm.
Because if you think about what politeness is a verbal way of living in honor and shame worlds, right? So I call you an idiot, I call you a hack. Well, those are shame terms. They intend to shame you, whatever I intend for the impact to be. They are kind of disgrace terms. Whereas if I say, my esteemed scholar friend Greg, right, then I'm so politeness.
Unless you're British, and then it's a dagger in the back. But yeah.
Okay, but again, there are British ways to sincerely
Be polite. I know.
sincerely honor
I
people.
just so admire the British capacity for saying the nastiest thing in the nicest way.
In the most beautiful,
It's
where you
astonishing.
leave thinking that you've been praised, and then only later on realize that you've been undone.
Americans are so ham-fisted in that stuff that I always marvel.
But so politeness theory
Yeah.
investigates these kinds of things. So these are things that you and I teach our kids, right? When you're at school, you call your teacher this, and you call Mr. So and so this, and we help them navigate that social world, which involves honorification, verbal honorification.
This is a question that came to mind while I was reading. Is the American sort of lexicon of respect actually about honor?
Oh, it is.
Okay.
And this is where then we run up against these labels, because in the article that you referenced, that chapter in the book, The Festschrift, what I try to do is provide a kind of radicalized definition that will capture more broadly all those things that actually deal with honor. Where self-esteem is really a dimension, it's an honor dynamic or an honor phenomenon, as well as politeness and the giving of respect. And these are wonderful ways, easy ways that you can take a class of students, as I like to do, into the world of honor and shame, and that's just by contravening or contradicting their normal codes, and then asking why that was troublesome. And what ends up coming out as they try to reason through that is the realization that they have this deep sense that certain kinds of people in certain contexts deserve a certain kind of respect.
Yeah.
As do they. And of course, we learn these things. They're very deep in us. We learn them from a very, very young age. So we often have given very little critical thought to why this and not that, and why that's a good term and that's not.
Right.
But as you then look at that, you realize that we in the English-speaking West engage in these honor and shame practices just as much, which is why I'm not suggesting at all that we're all the same thing, which would be a silly idea, but rather that honor shame cultures obscures far more than it helps point to any real distinction. And what it also does is it blinds us here meaning
right,
people like me, English-speaking Anglo-Western culture, of reflecting importantly on our own dynamics. And then it does tend to create this caricatured understanding of whether it's North Asian culture or Mediterranean, Middle Eastern culture, that is improper, that masks, that that leads to this kind of othering, which is often very unhelpful. And particularly, so here we've been talking broadly in anthropology, sociological, communication theory terms. But if you think about theology, and you think about doing the kinds of things that you and I both did, planting churches, making the case for a Christian life over against another kind of life, and so conversion, the ways that we frame our theology, our models of God, our theories of atonement, often reflect the more legal and guilt-oriented approach to things. And so when we so those that comes in together with these broad caricatures and continues to then drive this wedge, where we can see, well, Thai culture is not Christian culture because Thai culture doesn't think enough about guilt, right? Or thinks more in this way. And so it just continues to drive, it seems to me, a way of unhealthy and unhelpful way of thinking about cultural difference that's obscured by the titles honor, shame, guilt, innocence. And we need better language that recognizes the universality of the honor, shame, face experiences, but then allows us to then properly discuss what those real differences are.
So I was wondering, how would you characterize then the difference between shame and guilt in these sort of
Yeah.
technical terms? Because I almost want to just layer on the objective subjective thing again. It's like
Yeah,
guilt
it's not that easy. And of course, that's one of the things that Benedict did. What she did was she said shame is this completely objective external experience that's attuned to public opinion, reputation, and guilt is the developed, internalized moral conscience that many believed was the possession of a Western Christianized culture. Moral theorists as well as social psychologists have done a pretty thorough job of just absolutely tearing that
Yeah,
down.
that seems a little sketchy.
Right.
But
But
yeah, I mean,
what
it's like
happened?
I can be guilty without feeling guilt,
Sure.
and I can be and I,
And you
can
can
I
be
is it possible?
shamed
Yeah,
without feeling ashamed, which is what we're,
right. But
which is,
can I be guilty without feeling shame?
yes,
Yes.
yes. So, the old saying that I'm sure most of our listeners are familiar with: "Sticks and stones may
Hmm.
break
Hmm.
my bones, but names will never harm me or hurt me."
Words will never hurt me.
Words,
Yeah.
however,
Yeah.
names, words. Of course, we keep teaching our kids that because words actually do hurt, or names
Hmm.
do hurt. Name calling is an attempt to shame people,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And what we are trying to do is instill in, let's say, our children the capacity to say, I recognize what you're doing here, but I don't buy it. And so I don't feel shame.
Right,
That,
because that kind of bullying that we're imagining in this scenario
right.
is an attempt to shame untethered from the evaluative system. So what we're
Well,
really trying to do is tell our kids there's a way of deciding whether or not you should be ashamed,
right.
and
Well,
they're not judging correctly.
that's right. I wouldn't say that it's untethered from the evaluative system because it's working on an evaluative system. But what we're saying is we have a different system, right? We have a different set of excellences or virtues that we're going to attach ourselves to, and it's not what those people are doing.
Okay,
Now, especially at the playground level, it's not particularly sophisticated and well thought out.
sure.
But at the societal level, whatever you might think of our former president, Donald Trump, one of the things that's undeniable, and I'm sure there are already doctoral dissertations being written on this, is that, especially with his use of Twitter, but also just his public, speeches, were classic examples in the power to praise and shame.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And he is stunningly effective in the sense of accomplishing his ends, which reflect on a specific set of virtues, things that he considers, whatever those might be. And some of us might say, well, those aren't my virtues, and therefore I can't go where he goes here. But it is the case that most of us do engage, and this is where I would critique Brene Brown. She shames. She just does it with certain types of audiences that
Mm-hmm.
that don't participate in her set of virtuous moral standards of what is good and honorable and right.
Mm-hmm.
And she might not be particularly harsh, but she might be. I don't know her personally. One of the things that we're really talking around is the complexities of both honor and shame, and I would add face too. And so what we often do, not you, but we as a sort of generalized, particularly American English speaking audience, is we latch onto one dimension of a quite complex thing. And then we say that's honor or that's shame. And then we go looking for it. And what we've done is it's just a classic reductionism where, for
Right.
example, with shame, you have multiple valences. And if you read in the literature, you have what's called episodic shame, which is shame that, connects to specific things I did, right? You have what's called dispositional shame, which is the kind of thing that Brene Brown tends to point more towards.
Mm.
You have prospective shame and retrospective shame. That is shame that looks back in regret at things that you have done. You have prospective shame, which both Confucius and Aristotle were big fans of. And I might add Paul also, a kind of shame, an awareness of boundaries past which you become shameful.
Right. Well,
And
even
therefore,
Jesus uses that language of, I will be ashamed of whoever is ashamed of me.
exactly. And so what that kind of prospective shame does, it's a sensibility. If you don't have that, by the way, we call that person shameless. And that's
Yeah.
not a good thing, is it? To be
No,
shameless.
no.
It
But
means
but it's so, but it, yeah, it is so curious to me that in the Brene Brown post purity culture Christian world, because I mean I'm saying that Brene Brown's, I think she has had an influence on
definitely
the subculture that I'm thinking of, the people that I have conversations with,
right.
where it becomes obvious that the assumption is that shame is always bad in the sense that I
It's
shouldn't
essentially
feel it. It's
it's essentially
psychologically
injurious.
damaging to me to
Right.
feel. Yeah, it's injurious. And to shame, which I mean, I think probably a lot of people are familiar with a parenting style that shames in a toxic way, a damaging way,
Right.
that's unnecessary. But at the same time, there is a shame as a lever in relationships that it's about sort of making these evaluative judgments in regard to excellence, right? And
Right.
so
Right.
so it's so strange to me on an experiential level that someone would say I'm not supposed to feel shame because it's been very important for me at times in my life to feel shame, to know I should have done better, but even more so to read scripture and come to any conclusion that suggests you're not supposed to feel shame because
It,
because
that's a
all
perfect
throughout scripture, contrary to your earlier caricature of Christianity being focused on guilt rather than shame, all throughout scripture the dominant evaluative discourse is about honor and shame.
it is.
And so it's wild to me to think like you shouldn't shame people and then read Jesus say, I will be ashamed of you. And you're like, Jesus, don't shame us. That hurts us emotionally.
Right. 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 Exactly.
I don't understand
And
how you
so
even come to that conclusion.
that, and I again, I think there are all kinds of probably complex reasons why we do come to that conclusion. I recall specifically inviting our neighbors over for dinner one time when we lived close to Fuller, and they had been missionaries in Western Africa, and we were sitting down to eat, and we didn't know them super well. Our kids played together, so we started talking about my doctoral research, and I started talking about what and the wife immediately said, "Oh, I hate shame. Shame is such a terrible, destructive,
Yeah.
really sort of parroting, maybe a caricatured, maybe Brene Brown is more complex than I think she is. There may be
Yeah.
stuff that I haven't read, but she was essentially parroting the kind of line that you just described. And then I simply pulled out a couple of verses from Paul in
Mhm.
First Corinthians, where Paul tells the Corinthian church, I'm ashamed of you. I say this to your shame.
Yeah.
And it was as if for the very first time in her life, she like those two worlds for her had been operating completely independently.
Completely separately.
Completely.
Yeah.
And she went, well, it's, oh, she went, whoa. I hope I didn't, I didn't shame her.
No.
But I was just trying to say, yeah, so if you're a Christian and in some way validate these texts as appropriate and authoritative, you're going to have to deal with Jesus. You're going to have to deal with Paul. You're going to have to deal with the prophets. You're going to have to deal with the fact Lynn Hubner is an Old Testament scholar who has written on this. And she's right. There is almost in the Hebrew Bible no, and she argues even harder, that there is no guilt experience, period. That the exclusive reaction to human sinfulness in the Hebrew Bible is one of shame. And the Hebrew word asam, which we translate often in English as guilt or guiltiness.
The feeling of guilt. Yeah.
But see, that's where she would argue that would be a improper translation. That it's about culpability, right? So
objective
guilt itself
culpability.
we
Yeah.
can parse in at least two distinct ways. One is
Mm-hmm.
the fact of guilt, and you
Right.
hinted at this because you can be guilty and not feel guilty, right?
Right.
So there are feelings, internal emotions, self-conscious emotion of guilt. Then there's also the fact of guilt, right? And she argues that, in fact, this is the exclusive sense that's used in the Hebrew Bible, and that the proper way to feel the emotional, evaluative reaction to human sinfulness is one of shame.
Mm-hmm.
That does flow into the New Testament, particularly Paul, some in Jesus. And I think that this is where, there is in biblical studies, this particular set of scholars called the context group. And though I quibble with much of the things that they do because they really are Benedictine in their general approach, so they are as much, I think, guilty of perpetuating caricatures as they are in shedding light on Scripture. Mm-hmm. But they do this. Other biblical scholars like David De Silva, who really help us see clearly how powerful these themes are in the New Testament. And I would argue from an anthropological perspective that the only way for any culture anywhere to not have honor and then shame would be to have no sense of excellence or virtue.
Exactly.
But I don't think, and here I could be wrong, but I don't think you can make a culture without a sense of virtue and excellence. So I think we're stuck, and I'm not considering that an unfortunate set of conditions.
No,
but to say that humankind, when they do civilization and culture, inevitably produce these canons that result in honor and shame. And shame is inevitably created when we have virtue, because shame is, at least in two broad senses, shame is falling short of a standard of some kind. In fact, what is really intriguing is that Romans 3:23, a verse that says all have sinned and fall short of God's honor, the glory of God, is a scripture that has been used pervasively, especially in the recent several decades, in evangelistic programs that trade on inculcating a sense of guilt and guiltiness before a holy God.
Right.
Whereas the verse itself connotes, if not denotes, the hustaruntai, that verb that Paul uses there, is a verb classically in Greek that talks about falling short, right? Failing to measure up. And that's a shame experience. So ironically, one of the key verses of this whole approach to doing evangelism and sharing the gospel may very well actually rest on a verse that is mostly about honor and shame, which is a little ironic. I think that's what we might call ironic.
But you're also closing the gap between guilt and shame anyway. So in another sense, it's not. It is about the fact of shameful conduct producing shame, or guilty conduct producing a feeling of guilt, if those two things really aren't actually distinct existentially.
There is a huge discussion in the scholarly world on the proper distinctions between the guilt experience and the shame experience. Mm-hmm. Traditionally, and I think where I would say things kind of rest right now, is that guilt tends in italics to focus on the action of the individual.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas shame tends, and again, this is complicated by when you look at Japanese shame and Chinese guilt, and the categories tend to blur. But well, let's go with this what I'm about to say. Shame tends to do more globalizing work. That is, they both are reactions to an infraction, an inadequacy, but one, guilt, tends to stay fairly externalized and locked onto the behavior, what's called in the psychological literature specific attribution. I did something wrong. That thing I did was wrong. I'm guilty. That thing out there it's wrong. It could be mundane. I accidentally called you a bad name and I shouldn't have done that, and I was wrong and I apologize. Or it could be something, I murdered a person and I'm guilty. Whereas in shame, this tends to be the case, that shame can look even at the same. There are no such things as guilt-inducing or shame-inducing infractions. That could be the very same event. But in one event, once one person localizes it, focuses on an external thing that one did, and focuses on the behavior, on the shame experience, what the person does is it globalizes to the self, and it says, that thing I did was wrong. I'm bad. Or,
Yeah, so there's the objective subjective thing
right,
going on
I
again.
am ashamed because in some way it points to the me.
Yeah.
And so when you look at scripture and you look at the preponderance of shame reaction to sin throughout both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, what I think that this points to, and Romans 3:23 would be a great example of this, is that sin is something more than merely external behavior.
Mm-hmm.
That biblically, sin reflects something about the kind of persons we are as well.
Right.
We are morally defective selves. And
Yes.
here I'm not getting into, the whole Reformed conversation about original sin and the total depravity thing. But I think it's fair to say that sin is more than just mere actions, right? That there is this sense biblically that our life before God is of a kind of defective existential state that can't be captured merely in just pointing to legal infraction. The other thing that has served this whole dichotomy is that in the more recent West, I mentioned Hobbes, I mentioned Locke, and other important, more modern Western thinkers, political thinkers and philosophers, really distrusted shame as a strategy, as a social strategy, and as a strategy to base societies upon. So they fell back on a more legal and therefore guilt, because ultimately guilt trades more upon a legal framework,
right,
as a way of properly guiding society forward. And so all the time in England, in France, and North America, you still had lots of shame stuff happening.
right.
The dominant trope, or sort of culturally approved narrative, was we are a culture of laws and not men, right? And there's a positive side to that too. But what that does is it works itself into Christian theology, where we think of God primarily as a lawgiver with a courtroom, right, metaphor, and that we sinners who break the law of God, and to convert that to a shame perspective, all you have to do is internalize the law as something not external to God, but something that actually is a part of God's person, that emanates out of the nature of God. And then all of a sudden, as I found in Thailand, when you talk about God and the law of God in that way, all of a sudden people recognize that they're properly shameful. You think about this, the younger son in Luke 15 is a great example of that, and how that parable captures that story, where you see it's not just the son broke some sort of social rules that he now has to make up for, but that in some sense he breaks God, the father's heart, a sense of bringing shame on the father and himself. And throughout Scripture, we see that clearly. It is that there was this hiccup of a couple of centuries in modern theology and the church, where we really focused primarily on this legal set of connotations and metaphors that has pushed us to thinking very strongly in guilt terms and failing to then understand the power and the importance of the rest of that puzzle.
Well, so in some sense, the cultural attention given to shame these days is a kind of correction, in that it's paying a lot more attention to those
So,
the the effects, the social effects of the shame dynamics, particularly in parenting, and then with the case that I'm raising, simply
right.
because it's the one that uses shame language the most prolifically, the purity culture fallout
Yeah.
situation. And
And
so
what,
it's like they're paying attention to shame, but don't seem, I don't know, like my tell me what you think of this. I mean, my diagnosis of that situation, not personal, not I'm not talking about personal experiences. I'm talking about the way that it's being talked about at the level of social discourse,
right.
is essentially a claim that, given your definition of honor and conversely shame, that there should be no standard of moral excellence in regard to our children's sexuality,
Yeah, right.
right?
And none of
It's
us
like,
would actually argue that. Even Brene
no,
Brown wouldn't argue that.
no, right. And so it's like, if we're going to accept that shame is a function of falling short of moral excellence in regard to something like sexual ethics,
Mhm.
then the question isn't, should we quote shame our children by telling them what that standard is, or evaluating with them their own conduct, but rather we should look at the dynamics of like healthy and unhealthy, I don't know if that's the right terminology in the literature, but like there's good shame
Yeah.
and there's bad shame, right? There's
Well, yeah.
and
Brene Brown's preferred term that's really gained traction in the popular vernacular is toxic shame.
okay.
And I really think what you just said is great. I was just thinking you should write my next article. Um, One of the things that, and I suspect that this is cyclical, and what Brene Brown and others are doing is they are reminding us of how powerful
Yeah.
shame is, and how deleterious and negative improperly utilized forms of honoring and shaming can be, especially to the developing moral conscience of our children, for example.
Yeah. Yeah.
But not just that. I would suspect that Brene Brown would probably have less issue with shaming publicly her detractors, or maybe those who engage in all kinds of behavior, political or social, that she recognizes as improper, right? But
Hmm. Hmm.
we often think of our kids, and that's the tender spot for us. So the question is, the purity culture that you reference. How do you helpfully inculcate a sense of self, a sense of excellence and virtue, all the while recognizing that by doing so, you have created the conditions which could result in shame?
Of course.
And then when that does happen, how does the gospel narrative change the way we do that?
There it is.
And how does it provide? It seems to me that one of the important differences is it provides this strata or structure of a God who loves, who is for us and not against us, who intensely desires our own good, both morally as well as potentially in other ways. And that narrative that comes to us through the person of Jesus, that tells us that, and here's where I would push against my depravity friends, because if you have a certain theological take on this, then you're gonna have a greater challenge, it seems to me,
Yeah.
to deal with this. If we are totally depraved, and we really
Right.
are just greasy worms,
Right.
and that's really who we are,
Yeah.
and the gospel story is here to tell us that, and that God I guess, saves us, even though we are classically this bunch of yuck. That's not the way I hear the gospel story nor read it, and I think that's fundamental substructure of gospel narrative that tells us that we are loved, that we are
Hmm.
good. Yeah, we're all evil too. We are depraved at a level, and we are worthy of shame at a level. And yet the gospel is just like Luke 15, which I find is a compelling place to go back to, is this father who recognizes it. But one of the things I love about the father in that story is that he doesn't give the son a third degree, right?
No.
He doesn't say, well, let me think about it. But before you get to come in the house, let me
Right.
tell you a few things. Do you see your mother over there?
Yeah, yeah.
And so there are different ways of shaming, and I'm not suggesting that we can just simply cut and paste
No.
the parable and make that our standard. But it's consistent, I think, throughout both the Gospels and also in the rest of the New Testament, that the story of the good news of Jesus helps us to realize that there is a counter narrative that pushes against the dominant forms of shaming and honor in our own cultural context, and then calls us as Christian parents, as Christian citizens, to engage that with a radically different set of narratival components.
Yeah, that makes so much sense to me because it seems as though we're talking about the difference between, I think you called it situational shame or uh,
Episodic or
episodic
situation.
shame. You
Yeah,
said
right.
episodic shame, and what I just keep thinking of is existential shame,
Sure.
right? And
Dispositional is the social science word, but
okay, yeah.
existential is just
Well,
as
because I want to talk about it on a metaphysical level once we're
right.
into the world of
Right.
theology, and to say like I should feel shame about my episodic failures before the standard of excellence that is
Right.
the fullness of Jesus Christ. And yet the gospel is that I don't have existential shame because ultimately what God ascribes to me is the truth about myself,
Absolutely. In fact,
right?
I want to say that is so key. I've written down in a an outline of a book that I'm hoping to write, and one of the chapters is uh, when God when God says it, it's true, and that's the answer to this existential or dispositional form
Mhm.
of what I think Brene Brown would call toxic shaming.
Mhm.
And that is, I keep coming back. There is an older devotional song, you might be familiar with it, called I Will Change Your Name.
Oh yes.
I will change your name. You shall no longer be called wounded, outcast, lonely, or afraid.
Yeah, we still sing that one in my church.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
love that song because it does exactly, it illustrates exactly what you're talking about.
There's a
That is
newer one. I don't know how new it is, but if y'all haven't sung it at your church, you need to introduce it, but
all
it's
right.
I am who you say I am.
I love that. Okay.
Yeah.
And so
That,
there's where there's that solution. No, that's too easy because what we're going to find is in life, people, society will push back against that narrative, but also internally, right? I have personally this incredible, because of what happened to me growing up and things that I've done, this counter narrative that keeps popping up that says, no, 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 Flanders, you are a loser, right?
mhm. Mhm.
You are helpless. You
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
whatever. Um, and so it is actually a practice of discipleship to have to continue to re-narrate the who I am, who you say I am, right?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And that is, of course, again, the affirmation of the loving Creator. Levinas talks about the face as the moment where uh, love and acceptance are mediated to the other, and I think that's
Yeah.
exactly the metaphor in the Hebrew scriptures is the face of God, right? May His face shine on you, right?
Yeah.
And the warm, loving, accepting face of our Creator gives us this different narrative, and so life for me basically is recalibrating to that
Yes.
narrative. And then,
Well, I like that you call it a practice of discipleship because one of the things that we do in our discipleship groups, which I learned from Todd Vogt, Mission Alive,
mhm.
there in Dallas. And it's weird to me, Chris, that I had to learn this late in life after I was a missionary. But that there's this fundamental shift that the gospel generates in us, and we use Henri Nouwen's three lies. I'm sure you've heard this before, right? But there are these lies about the self that go something like I am what others say about me. So that would be very strong in cultures that worry about that ascription of honor in a major way. Uh, I am what I have, and that's not just possessions. That's things like family and so on. Or I am what I do, which tends to be my problem. Nouwen says, it's there's we struggle with all three of these lies. I am what others say about me. I am what I have. I am what I do. But everybody usually kind of struggles with one principally, and that the gospel is essentially that the truth is I am God's beloved, right? And so we use this in our discipleship groups because it is literally a practice of reminding each other. So we'll be in conversations. I introduce the concept and we kind of work through the material. And then months later, we'll be in conversations about something going on in somebody's life. And somebody will go, now hold on, you're not what others say about you. Right. And it's like, it's this powerful,
Right.
reiterative truth that we have to keep telling ourselves our whole life long.
That's wonderful. And, the fact that Henry Nouwen, a Western person, obviously, educated in the West and living, as far as I know, his whole life and work here, would have to a Western English speaking audience, remind us that we are not what other people think we are, which again is
Right.
that classic, right, characterization of the honor shame culture. And yet here
Right.
is Henry Nouwen, diagnosing that as one of the key bad narratives that we fall into. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's true, in cultures where there are more higher group or collectivistic. In social psychology, they talk about the independent self configuration and the interdependent self configurations, and these are the interdependent self is much more prevalent in places like Japan or Thailand or Peru, and so when you have an interdependent self,
Mm-hmm.
then you are much more likely to grant importance to others' opinions about you. And so
Mm-hmm.
there again is why it pulls in that direction. Why in the West? Because the narrative that we've been taught to recognize and hold on to is a more independent self, an individualistic self. Then perhaps we've tended. Sometimes we probably have, but we have thought we are better at doing that.
Mm.
But Nouwen's 3 points reminds us that we're not A plus in that regard.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful set of discipleship practices. That's
Yeah. It's been incredibly powerful consistently across multiple groups. And just as it astounds me at how late I heard that
mm,
message,
mm,
it astounds me how few of the I mean, most of the people in our discipleship groups at this point have been in church a long time.
right.
And they're consistently like, I've never heard that my fundamental core bedrock identity, myself, is God's beloved. That's who I am, and everything else is external to that.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it's been pretty powerful.
And so it's really resting secure in that narrative
Hmm.
that allows then for us to even embrace episodic shame
That's right.
or
That's right.
retrospective shame, where we can then look back and go, that was shameful.
Yeah,
The way
exactly.
I talked to my kids or my wife, or the way I behaved in certain ways. And also to then embrace the potential, because I know who I am and I know that I can forget that narrative.
Yeah.
And I can all of a sudden become this, incurvatus se, this self-enclosed, grouchy person who will
Mm-hmm.
do and say things that are shameful. So
Right.
the prospective form of shame can also then serve, as long as I'm, as you've articulated so beautifully, as long as I'm centered and grounded in that narrative, and I'm trying to do my best to believe that. On my good
Yeah.
days, I believe it. On my bad days, I say, God, you obviously don't know me well enough,
Right.
right?
Right.
But that's the journey of discipleship.
Yeah, and so to stick with the prodigal story, right? They're not mutually exclusive truths that he has to be able to look at himself wallowing in pig slop
Yep.
and
He
say
comes to
this.
himself. Luke tells
Yeah,
us,
it
right?
comes to himself and sees himself and knows that this is shameful.
Yep.
This is wrong.
Right.
I've been wrong. I've made the wrong choices. That is true. And you should feel some kind of way about that. If you don't, you're going to stay right there, right?
Yep.
So you feel a certain way, and that's not mutually exclusive with the truth that and my father loves me so fundamentally that I'm accepted,
And I think that's
right?
the journey of the younger son there. And I suspect still, though it's not explicated for us, the journey of the older son there too. Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Needs then to lean into and then operate in the universe of the father's lavish, overwhelming honorification. Right
Mm-hmm.
now, we might translate that in more personal or sweet terms.
Yeah, like affection,
Affection.
but there's more going on with the
I
ring and the
suspect that
yeah.
there is affection there, though I wasn't there, and I guess that the father could be operating completely in a sense of social. But my suspicion is based on other parts of Scripture as well, that the idea here is one of gushing affection,
Well,
and
he runs to him, right?
he
I mean,
does run
that's
to him,
the
and he covers his shame, and he then adds to again, so to counter this narrative that is that the father either suspects the son has either adopted about himself or is certainly in danger of adopting about himself, that is, he is inferior and pathetic and a capital L loser. And
and that's the narrative his brother has
that
adopted
is the
about him.
narrative that the brother has adapted, and is obviously just as much about the religious righteous as it is
Mm-hmm.
the prodigal. But the whole point, it seems to me, and this is why I like to call that parable the parable of the loving father rather than the prodigal son,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that's the point.
I do too.
Is those things that he goes over and beyond, right? He didn't have to do
Mm-hmm.
any. He doesn't have to give him a ring. He doesn't have to give him slippers. He doesn't have to throw him a big party. He could just say, "Come on back. You're good." And I think this is a window into the nature of the giving, uh, lavishly honoring God,
Mm-hmm.
who recognizes and affirms, and I think that is, if that is the core narrative that we can adapt and live into, then that will give us moorings to then deal with shame issues properly.
Yeah, properly.
Yeah.
That's very well said. Okay, I've got you running over 2 hours at this
Are
point,
you
so
kidding? This feels like we've been talking like 10 minutes. This is so much.
I know I don't want to pull the chute, but I also know you've got other things to do. So
I got to go eat
um,
lunch.
yeah. So we will have to come back to the future of theological education in another episode. But
Yeah,
I look
give
forward
me a
to
week or
hearing
so
your
to
thoughts about
actually
that.
completely figure that one out before I come
Okay,
back and
good,
talk about
good.
it.
Yeah. I like some very
Yeah,
concrete
I'll have it figured out by
solutions.
then. So yeah, I hope everybody saw my eyes roll as I said that.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for taking the time and for such a rich conversation. I think people are really going to be interested by this whole world of honor shame and the complexity of the constructs there and the way that it relates so deeply to us. And so I'm excited. I'm excited for people to listen in.
You're welcome. And thank you for giving me the opportunity. Nothing like a 2-hour conversation with my friend Greg.
Appreciate it. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, then, I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.